director here at the YAM, and this is absolutely my favorite time of the year. The annual art auction is such a celebration of the talent in our region, the range of artwork that is being made across Montana and neighboring states, and it's just such a joy to see all of these pieces come together in our galleries and ultimately find exciting new homes. It's really wonderful, and we are so grateful to all of the artists who make this annual fundraiser possible. If you haven't already been upstairs to explore the art auction galleries, I hope you'll have an opportunity to do that either later this evening or in the days to come. The big event itself will be on Saturday, March 7th, and we hope that many of you will be with us that night as well. One of our favorite parts of the art auction each year is having the opportunity to hear directly from several of the artists who are included. And so tonight is the first of 3 artist talks that we'll be hosting by artists who are included in the galleries upstairs. And I'm really pleased to introduce ceramic artist Joe Taylor, who explores the emotional state of wonder through his abstract sculptures, which investigate the intricate relationships between people, landscapes, creatures, and the natural world. Rooted in curiosity and play, his work reflects a fascination with the microscopic and the macroscopic, the human and the geological. A former K-12 art teacher for 15 years, yay, art educators, Taylor embraces inquiry as a transformative learning tool. He recently graduated with an MFA in ceramic sculptures from the University of Montana, and he is currently a long-term resident at Red Lodge Play Center. Please help me in welcoming Joe Taylor.
For the introduction, and thank you guys all for being here. Very excited to be a part of the art auction this year and to be able to share my work, and also just so excited to see the show that's upstairs, the curation, and just the whole combination of artists in the space is really beautiful. It's really special, so I'm happy to be a part of it. Like was mentioned, I'm originally from Nevada, but I've been up in Montana for the last 4 years. I did spend the last 3 years in Missoula, Montana, getting my Master's of Fine Arts in ceramic sculpture, and then have currently got the opportunity to move to Red Lodge, where we'll be for 2 years as a long-term artist and resident there. So it's really great to be able to spend more time in Montana and do some exploring. In my talk, I'm going to give you guys basically a pretty thorough background into some of the philosophical thinking of my work, and some of the books that I'm interested in reading that have guided me, and a lot of like my experience growing up in Nevada, and also as being a teacher. And then I'll get into some of the how I actually make my work. So some of the processes that I'm using that are related to these sort of like activities I do outside of the studio that influence me. And in the end, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the biomorphic abstract artists that inspired me from a long time ago, and then bring it into more contemporary artists now that I'm looking at constantly that are helping me sort of, find my family, as you might say, in the art world. All right. So I was born and raised in the Reno area, and the reason I like to include this slide is because very kind of similar to Billings, Reno is geographically isolated. So if you were to drive from Reno north, kind of go all the way to the edge of the state of Nevada and into Oregon before you hit any sort of larger cities. If you drive to the east, you have to cross the entire state of Nevada into Utah to Salt Lake City and Provo. Going south, you follow the 395 corridor along the Sierra Nevada mountains until you hit either Las Vegas or Los Angeles, which is like 9 hours and 12 hours away. And then the only exception is if you drive to the west, you get to Sacramento in the Central Valley of California within 2 hours. But to get there, you have to get up and over the Sierra Nevada mountain range in the Tahoe National Forest. And the reason this is important is it kind of illustrates, you know, that much of my upbringing was spent moving between these rural wilderness spaces and back in town where I went to school. And so this is what my hometown of Fernley, Nevada, it's 30 miles east of Reno, sort of looks like. And you get a sense right away that the landscape is really empty and it's really, really vast. And my parents loved this place. They loved especially taking me out into the wilderness on just about every weekend. And as a young boy, I just wanted to be at home playing video games. But alas, there was no internet, there was no cell service in these places. But what was really great about it is, as a young person, I sort of got this idea deeply instilled in me that, you know, out in the mountains and these valleys, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of like unknowns, and we were sort of trying to prepare ourselves to go into these places every weekend. But then coming back to town, going to school, all the trees were planted in straight lines, and all the pavement was leveled and flat, and there was a lot more certainty, a lot more control in that. And I think that this really played heavily into how I build my sculptures, is I tried to sort of bridge the two of these things together. I try to find a sort of my own wilderness, my own sort of unknown that I can venture into, and gather information, maybe come up with some new ideas, and then bring that back into something more concrete and stable, maybe more logical, that I use as a building, as a baseline for the sculptures that I build. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. It's called Wilderness and the American Mind by Roderick Nash. That's him there on the left. And this book, I think, was really, I learned about it in grad school, and it was really interesting because he gave a really clear picture of how American people coming to this place had sort of changed their opinions on what the wilderness meant. And in the beginning, it was all about the wilderness was this thing, this unknown that needed to be tamed, this unknown that sort of needed to be controlled so that it was safe and easy. And then as time went on, this attitude towards wild spaces became a little bit softer. People started to see wilderness as like a source of beauty, a source of inspiration, and maybe even a source of knowledge. And so in the book, he says, psychologically, man is still attuned to the woods and fields and waters. He's come a long way, but not far enough to forget. Civilization is only a thin veneer over the deep evolutionary flow of things that built him. As a corrective measure, some people seek the wilderness once a month or once a year, as a sick man might go to his physician. In wild country, they slip back into the ancient grooves and regain perspective. Wilderness, the American mind. And so I love this idea that not only is he saying that, like, you know, we have sort of separated ourselves from these wild spaces, maybe thinking of ourselves as being separate from, you know, the natural world in some regards, and we've like built ourselves into these cityscapes which are very isolated and controlled, but then we come from a place where we are at home in those wild spaces. So even today as we exist in towns and cities, it's often that we go back into the wilderness to sort of like regain perspective, right? To re-feel that connection to the other things around us in our environment. And also I think in a lot of ways, especially in Nevada, those landscapes make me feel really small. And when I'm not the biggest, most important thing in that landscape, it's a lot easier for me to sort of like see the relationships between myself and those things around me. And so I think it's interesting, you know, he's also suggesting that going into those unknown spaces is that medicine, right? And we go there and we learn something and then we bring it back into our civilization. And that brings me to these guys. So these are some of my students. I was a kindergarten through 12th grade art teacher for about 15 years. They were very wild. They're their own sort of wilderness. But the school that I worked for, I thought was really interesting, and I kind of took a lot from them. It was based on Outward Bound, and the idea was that we were going to put students into challenging situations on purpose, but just challenging enough so we're not damaging them. And then we were going to let them grapple or sort of, you know, deal with that adversity as a way of creating meaningful learning and meaningful moments in their lives. And so I ended up doing a lot of that myself as a teacher. But when I was still teaching, I learned about this book called The Ecology of Imagination in Childhood by Edith Cobb. And this was really amazing for me to find because she talks about children's sense of wonder. It's kind of the way that they engage with some new content. But what is also really wonderful is in this book, she's talking not so much to children, but she's talking to adults who've made like meaningful changes in society. They've had these really big revolutionary ideas. And she's asking them where they got all their great ideas, obviously. And they all kind of respond that they hearken their great moments of aha moments back to these experiences that were very childlike, where they were sort of looking and playing with the parts of a problem and sort of fiddling through them, losing sense of their self, as they say, and diving like fully empathetically into a problem and playing around with the parts. And it was through that sort of like deep looking and through that participation, that visual participation and action, play, that they came up with these new solutions to old problems. And this is what she says. Wonder is essential for creative thinking. Cobb describes wonder as a perceptual participation in the known and unknown, linking it to an intuitive form of knowledge necessary for artists, poets, and scientists alike. And so I love this. I love this idea that there are perhaps multiple ways for us to gain knowledge and understanding of the things in our world and in our own lives. And this perceptual participation is one of them. That by just looking and watching and engaging with our senses, not necessarily with our thinking brain, we can also glean things from our world that we can then use to bring into our arts. And so going back a little bit to the school and the adversity, I also really love adversity. And so often my partner and I go out into wilderness spaces and have adventures. And we never really are like the type of people that are trying to bag a peak. We're not like, oh, we're gonna go climb this mountain today. We kind of find a place we find interesting, we wander through it, and we see what is revealed through that wandering. And I like to point this out because I'm trying to bring this experience of wandering through wilderness spaces into my studio and have an analogous approach to making sculpture. So there's a certain part of it that's about wandering, and there's a certain part of it that's about refining and building and construction. The photo on the left is from a northern part of Death Valley called Eureka Dunes. And the thing that we found here is like a little gem that came out of the wanderings that day, is we kind of arrived in this valley and the sun was getting low, and so all the shadows got really long on the sand dunes. We started walking around on the sand dunes, enjoying the patterns and the color play. And then after a while, we found a ridge line that led up to what seemed like the top of the dunes. We made our way that direction. And as we're like almost up at the top of this dune, we start hearing this really crazy auditory sound. It sounded like it was far away at first, but then it got closer and closer as we walked. But it was really puzzling because there's like no train or no road anywhere near this sand dune. It's like miles and miles and miles and miles away from everything. But then, so we'd stop walking and the sound would go away. And then we'd start walking again on this ridgeline and the sound would slowly start building again. And then we would stop and we realized that the sound was coming from the sand sloughing off of the side of the sand dune. And we were kind of terrified. I was like, oh my God, this is not right. Like, are we in danger? What's going on? And we kind of like assessed the situation. We kept walking a little bit. Eventually we turned back because we were a little bit cowardly. And later down in camp, I did some research and found that this is a phenomenon that actually was covered by National Geographic in this specific spot, that sand dunes at a certain height have a tendency to slough off and have an auditory sensation that's created by the sand particles rubbing together. My mind was basically blown. This is one more story I'd like to tell you about a time when we were out wandering through the desert and then found something marvelous and wondrous. This is a cave that's up high on a mountain in Nevada in a place called Grimes Point. And so it's neat because when I came across this cave, I didn't really know what was up there, but I found this and I saw all these like drippy, formations on the ceilings and walls, and they were familiar to me. I'd seen these formations before. They're actually called tufa. And tufa is something that you see in other bodies of salt water in Nevada that have been formed from like some natural spring bubbling up, and then the calcium and the salt mixing together and creating a calcium carbonate structure, which is the bubbly, wonderful textured walls. But what was remarkable about finding this there on top of the mountain is that this implied that the valley I was in used to be underwater. And so all of a sudden, just this random thing that I stumbled across in the desert was expanding my understanding of that place. Like, no longer was I in a dry desert, but I was on a seabed, you know, and no longer was this cave like maybe somebody's shelter, but it was probably somewhere where fish used to like hang out. I think it's those sorts of surprises that are examples of how, you know, wandering into the wilderness, not really having an agenda, can really reveal some astounding and wonderful things that we can bring into our practice. This is another book from Denise Marikonish. She wrote this essay about this art show at Mass MoCA, which is a big sculpture institution. And it's called Explode Every Day, an inquiry into the phenomena of wonder. And she does a really wonderful job of separating out the terms curiosity and wonder. She talks about them and separates them out in a nice way. She says, curiosity tends to elicit a desire to know. Wonder precedes curiosity. Wonder strikes, wonder leaves you breathless. Wonder then exists in the space between perception and knowledge, which is a state of acceptable confusion where language fails and full understanding eludes us. And so what I love about this is that, you know, often we feel that, you know, I wonder what that means. I wonder what this is all about. But I think that when we use that word, we're actually kind of meaning that I'm curious about what this is. So she's making this distinction that wonder is an experience that is more emotional than it is mental. It's something that you are struck with, and it kind of like is this overwhelming sensation with your senses. And then after a couple of moments of that, your brain switches over to curiosity mode. And this is about, so what am I looking at? This is me trying to figure out what the heck is going on with the cave. You know, where did it come from? Why is it here? And those answers are also really valuable, but I think that's just a different understanding, a different way of knowing. And so in my practice, I'm trying to bring in both of these. This is a really common and probably familiar diagram to many of you, this idea that humans have a left brain and a right brain. And so on the left side, it would be maybe like more closely associated with curiosity. We've got logic, we've got the sciences, having a sense of time, and we're like the language center of our brains. But then on the right side, we have something more like creativity, the arts, intuition, and imagination. And as much as I love this diagram because it helps me so clearly illustrate what I'm trying to sort of get at in my practice and in this lecture, I think that it's too simple. I don't actually believe it. I think that we're actually way more complicated as human beings, and that we're constantly using both our left brains and our right brains, our whole brains, all the time in every situation. And so it's a good roadmap, but it doesn't really get us all the way there. However, I did use this sort of as a way to outline different processes that I can make sculpture with. I'm going to get into that now. I'm going to start talking a little bit about the way that I start with a more intuitive, playful approach to making, and then move into something that's more engineered, logical, and structured. And so this is these are 3 pages out of one of my sketchbooks, and basically they are the most freeing opportunity for me to be creative, right? I'm making marks on the page, not worrying too much about what they are, how they're interacting. I can make the drawings really quickly, so I'm not super invested in any of them, and I'm just often playing around with the way that my hand and arm are making marks and move, the forms that my own body makes on the paper, and then coupling that with maybe like drawings from photographs that I might find out in the nature, like that bubbly ceiling of the cave. I'll take a bit of that and add it as some forms in this, and I'll couple the 2 of them together. And I really love because I can take these parts and stack them and rearrange them and quickly just sort of play around, trying really hard not to overthink it, trying hard to sort of get out of my own way in terms of thinking like, what is this, what's it about? But this allows me to come up with composition, to come up with some designs that are basically going to have more dynamic qualities to them when I can make them into sculptures. You know, I can't actually easily design these things in real life, but that's the best part about a drawing. You don't have to abide by gravity. It's awesome. You can make a thing that sticks out like a tentacle like this, out of clay. In the real world, it wants to break off immediately, but in a drawing, you can do all kinds of things that don't behave normally. And so I really push into this being the most this is the wilderness that I'm exploring in my drawing practice and in my art practice. This is where I'm allowed to wander off trail and down and up and over another landscape and see what I find there. From here, I choose a few of the drawings that are really striking to me, and I start building them into smaller sculptures. And you'll see one of them is actually upstairs. And this smaller scale is really nice because it allows me to take the two-dimensional drawings that are defying gravity and make them work out the problems with how they can exist in three-dimensional space. The other thing is I can make a lot of these really quickly, so it's really nice to be able to work through ideas in three-dimensional space and see which ones are really striking and which ones aren't. But then also the color palettes. This is my first opportunity to start to think, how can I use color emotionally to enforce the relationships between the parts of these sculptures? How can I use color to sort of either suggest that these things are of a certain world, or to sort of like steer you away from, oh, if it looks like a leaf when I color it purple, is it a leaf anymore? So I love the playfulness with this scale. And then once I have some of these small sculptures that I am really in love with, I will start to build it larger. So this is the part of my practice where there's no more play, there's no more exploration. This is all about engineering. This is me putting all of the blocks in straight lines and planting the trees in straight rows, and making sure that I have the infrastructure there that I need to control the build from the bottom up. And so on the right, I'm figuring out how to balance this thing so I can continue to build this spiral. And on the left, I'm basically trying to figure out what sort of infrastructure I need to put inside of the piece so that when I close it and stack things on top of it, it won't collapse. And the beauty about this is that it allows me to build, especially when you have a solid plan, it allows you to sort of build structures to completion without running into unexpected problems. And one of those unexpected problems is that if you're building a sculpture from the bottom up, you have to, in this stage, you have to finish the sculpture 100% at the bottom. And then as you build on top of that, you have to finish the next section 100%, and you build up a little more and finish that 100%. The reason is that if I were to build the bottom and not finish it all the way, and I get to the middle, by the time it's time to put the texture and the sort of last touches on the bottom, it's too dry in clay. It's not going to allow me to alter it the same way it would when it was wet. So this is really that thinking ahead that's important in my practice. And this is a lot of what the work looks like. So these are some shots from my recent MFA show last spring in Missoula. Everything in this room is about, 3 feet tall and goes up to about 7 feet. It's a really large scale. And what was really nice about this space, I think, with all these larger sculptures in it, is that they started to create their own sort of environment in which you were just a guest. So it was almost like stepping into some sort of wilderness in which you were there to explore and move around and share space with these things, instead of just looking at them as some sort of a relic or like something else. Here's a couple more of them up close. This one is called Meaning Yellow. My wife likes to call it Oscar and the Worm. It's really big. It's probably like 7 feet long. This one's right down the middle. And the last one is called Hung Up on Blue. And you can see through some of these sculptures, they're not clear things. They're sculptures that represent or sort of reference things. Like I get a lot of sort of fungal things from this, but also I think the draping red bit over that horn is sort of a good example of how I often take cues from environments out in nature, like the way that rocks pile or stack up on each other, or the way that like a river washes bits and pieces of debris downriver that get hung up on other branches and drape over them. So I find that a part of like my rules for making sculpture is that I follow some of these stacking, tumbling ways that nature organizes things that I find in the wild spaces. Makes sense? But the question really still remains, what the heck is this? And the answer is, it's a blobject. So a blobject is a term used for blobby objects. It was coined by a guy named Karim Rashid, who is an Egyptian-born designer who was raised in Canada and then I think works in New York City. But this couple, Stephen Holtzcove and Mara Scove-Holtz, they wrote the book called Blobjects and Beyond, A New Fluidity in Design. And they're so cool because they point out how blobjects are everywhere in our world. And some of the places is like the most ancient blobjects are like river rocks, right? They've been eroded and tumbled by the water, make a really nice blobby form. And then if you think about it in popular culture, in our imaginations, blobjects become super technology, like spaceships in science fiction novels. They say that blobjects serve as the ideal visual representation of our increasingly fluid and changing culture. Our identities, boundaries, products, images, environments, and tastes in media, music, and literature are constantly changing, morphing, and intertwining towards a new kind of fluidity. The art and design of blobjects is more than just the artistic and cultural expression of our time. The blobject is this generation's master metaphor. It is our first psychologically and visually compelling answer to the question, how do biology, technology, culture, and emotion come together? And I think that this is really wonderful because I like this idea that, you know, it's acknowledging that our culture and everything and all of our preferences are constantly changing in the world, and so we're sort of like constantly trying to update and like reassess what is what in this world. But more so, the question at the bottom struck me, and so I had to go and spend some time thinking about this, and I asked myself that question: how does biology, technology, culture, and emotion play into the blobjects in my own life? And so I did a little bit of like thinking on it, and this is what I came up with. Technology. So this is an iMac G3. I was born in 1983, and so in the 1990s, or in 1993, I was 10 years old. And then through the rest of the 90s, I was like in the prime of my adolescent, you know, nerdy self. And so the computers had come out, you know, when I was younger, in the late 80s or earlier 90s. But the Macintosh was this really funny, chunky, blocky cube thing, the Macintosh computer. And then when the iMac G3 came out, it like revolutionized things. Like we were living in the future. And what was so fascinating is not only did it have this pleasing form, this blobject form, but the back panel of it was transparent or translucent. And so you could look inside of this thing and see the wires and the circuit boards and really have this, you know, deep curiosity and wonder for how was this new technology being delivered to you. And I don't necessarily make work exactly about the Mac G3, but I find that my sculptures sometimes carry this similar form. And here's an example of that. The piece on the right is one up in the auction. I'll go back a little bit so you can see it again and look at the forms. And I don't intend to do this, but I find that these things bubble up for me. You know, this is like through being willing to go into these unknown spaces in my creative practice, things start to reveal themselves. All right, this is the biology part. On the left is a scientific diagram of a pancreas, a large intestine, and a gallbladder. Kind of disgusting, but kind of awesome. And I love them because they are, they're so well nested together, and all the parts are so harmonious together, the way that that structure is working together. But more so than that is, you know, this is the inside of our bodies, and the inside of our bodies is a blobject, and that's amazing. So on the right too, we've got a cross section of a human skin diagram, so you can see like a hair follicle coming out. And I love like the twisty bits in this sort of diagram, and I love how like the skin cells towards the top of that drawing start to look like you know, maybe different layers of sediment or geology that you might find outside. So, you know, I think it's just really interesting to find these connections between the blobby things out in our world, the blobby things inside of ourselves. And this is some work that I felt was in line with those biological drawings. It's a painting of mine on the right, and then a sculpture on the left. Go back. And now, for the cultural bit, again, we're back to the 90s. So, I loved 90s cartoons, and especially these two cartoons. On the left is Rocko's Modern Life, and on the right is Ren and Stimpy. And they were so disgusting. They were like really pushing boundaries of like what a cartoon could be, who was it for, you know, what was the content of the cartoon. They were very emotional. They were really sometimes not very nice, but sometimes they were like overly loving. Just like all the human emotions compiled into one thing. And then I realized though, but yeah, the whole background and a lot of the characters themselves are objects. And so I find that some of that stuff comes into my work too. This is Good Graces on the left, and on the right is a piece called Dew Point. I'll go back. And it kind of is as surprising to me as it might be to you to like make these objects and then come back and see references to some of the similar colors and the forms in these cartoons that I grew up watching. So I'm really just interested in how these things kind of keep coming back up for me. And then the last answer to the question was emotion. And so the emotional part for me was always in connection to place. On the left, this is an example of a piece of erosion on some sandstone in southern Utah, a place that I've spent a lot of time exploring and riding my mountain bike. And then on the right is the north shore of Lake Tahoe with all of these really wonderful big granite rocks that have been eroded and tumbled down the mountain and then eroded over time by the water. And you know, I think that coming back to these places time and time again has sort of given me a familiarity with them. It's like gives me a sense of place, a sense of purpose that can only come through that sort of like spending time there. But I don't necessarily know how to make work about these places, but I try to make work sometimes that is deeply imbued with some heavy emotional qualities. So the ways that maybe the parts interact with each other, or and so on. So here's one example of that. This is called Quietly Read, and in my show, it was like the only piece that was by itself. It was relegated to a corner. And this piece is called Feeling All the Feels. And I love that, you know, it's really about the interaction between these two different forms, but it's up to the viewer, because of the ambiguity of the piece, it's up to the viewer to try to figure out, is this an oppressive relationship, or is this an embracing relationship? Like, what is it? And I had a person bring up a comment for me in a previous lecture where she saw this piece and she told me that this piece represented, or this piece for her was a place where she could go and work out her hard emotions. And I was like so touched by that, this idea that it was friendly enough for her to approach and then want to sort of project onto to try to figure out some things that maybe she was going through. And I just felt like I just pat myself on the back. Okay, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of the biomorphic abstractionists from the mid to late 1800s and into the 1900s, who of course have a huge impact on the work that I'm making. They were the frontier people of this, and they often make really large work, but funny enough, it's all very stony. It's all very like, yeah, granite and marble. This is Hans Peter Wilhelm Arp, Jean Arp as you might know him, or Jean Arp, I don't know how to really pronounce it. But he was born in 1886 and died in 1966. Very mysterious objects that he made. This is Dame Jocelyn Barbara Hepworth, born in 1903, died in 1975. Making really monumental biomorphic abstract works. But what is so wonderful about Barbara Hepworth is that she was a pioneer. You know, she didn't get the recognition that she deserved during her time, but she was sort of the one who first came up with the idea to pierce through these organic forms and sort of look inside of them. And you see that there are artists all from here on out that sort of reference that piercing. And I think that you can attribute it, and I definitely attribute my own piercing emotions to Barbara doing it first. And Henry Spencer Moore, 1898 he was born, in 1986 he died. And Henry Moore, of course, also making really large work, also very like marble and bronze, statuesque stuff, but he's a figure artist. And I love this idea that somebody was making figurative work that looked almost nothing like figure. It almost looks more like a boulder than it does like a figure. And I was like, that's genius. That's really cool to like be able to stretch that that conception of what our own bodies are. All right, and then these are a few small sculptures that I was making around the time I was looking closely at those artists. You see that the structures are very or the surfaces are very naturalistic, stony, almost replicating some sort of granite or rock that they were carved from. I was starting to figure out how the relationships between them could operate. This is me getting tired of that, making them into a pile, stacking them on top of each other. And then at a certain point, I wanted them to start having more dynamic, inhabit more dynamic spaces. And so the pieces were all about mean height, and I wanted to start to get them to climb up the walls, to start to go up overhead, and start to really engage the viewer with this sense of awareness of their own bodies when they were in the gallery looking at this work. Because a lot of the way that I created the work was about trying to go out and have these experiences, which kind of like put me on edge, which was about my sort of awareness of self in this place. And you bring, so I wanted to create some more interaction like that in the gallery. The other reason I like to show this photo though is that it marks a turning point for me in the work that I've been making. So this is like the last time that I was making work that had that stony color to it. From here on out, things got really bright and colorful. And a part of that was because I was just feeling like the work felt a little bit too serious. And I'm sure, as you can tell a little bit from my talk, I'm not that serious of a human. You know, I like to play, I like to sort of experiment and make jokes about things. Because I feel like humor is one of the most striking forms of understanding, right? It's like you really get a problem or understand a thing when you can make a joke about it. And so my work went from looking like this to looking like this. And so this is the middle gallery space in my MFA show, where I wanted it to draw you in and see all these weird red things dripping from the ceiling and on the walls. And so from the hallway outside the gallery, you saw this and you came into it. And we were putting sculptures on the floor in the walkway so that people had to walk around them. And we were also like dripping things down from the ceiling, so you had to not only be aware of just your feet, where you were standing, but aware of like what you were going to bump into with your shoulders or with your head. And so this is just an exciting experiment for me to figure out how I can get these sculptures that really start taking on a life of their own. And so then I'm going to talk a bit more now about contemporary artists that are a big influence on my work. This is Kenneth Price, born in 1935, died in 2012, and I think that he is one of the leading figures in the contemporary art world for biomorphic ceramic sculpture. But he was really great in pushing the boundaries. He pushed into his own sort of unknown because he didn't finish any of his sculptures with glazes. He was like, glazes don't do it for me, I'm gonna paint it. So he uses automotive paint, and he sprays on layers of automotive paint, and then he'll go back in and sand away that paint to reveal the layers underneath, and then putting on more. I just really love that confidence or that move to just use an entirely different material, and like, it doesn't matter if it's not clay anymore. So I've always looked up to Ken Price. This is Jenny Beck. She's from South Korea, but has been living in New York City, is an architect. She does this really wonderful thing where she's combining multiple figures together to, I think, create a bit of a narrative. But then she goes a step further and she's drawing on the surfaces of her forms, which I think is a nice way to sort of bring in more visual language to chew on in relationship to the forms. So I'm not sure what the story is. It kind of looks like that might be some sort of like a piece of meat or like little bits floating around in space. I've really enjoyed looking at her work. Jose Sierra is an artist from Venezuela who now lives in New Mexico, I think outside of Santa Fe. And again, just like maximalist, heavy surface decoration, employing painting on the surface, but also employing things dripping over the edges, using multiple colors, empty holes, things draping over one another. I think he's just really a master of sort of like pushing these pieces to the max and seeing how much information they can hold. And they become these incredibly visually striking objects that you have to keep coming back to. And lastly, this is probably my favorite sculptor of all time. His name is Matthew Ronay. And his work, though, is not clay. So he makes everything out of basswood sculptures. He's from Brooklyn, New York. And he's really does a great job, I think, of blending imagery from like the body, microscopic versions of it, and botanicals. So he's kind of got this exterior environment, internal world sort of colliding thing. But the thing that I think I've learned the most about from Ronay is that he's really doing a great job of getting the parts to either nest together really closely or to leave a little bit of space. So like these orange sort of drips on the piece on the left, as they're coming towards that larger red form, they don't quite touch it. It leaves just enough tension there so that my eye goes into that hole and makes me wonder if I go through that space, what happens when I come out the other side? You know, so I love that he's doing this. His Instagram handle, if you guys care to follow him, is called Mysterious Fog. And I think that just like summarizes it all, right? It is the mysterious fog of sculpture. But it's really, really alluring and interesting work, in my opinion. And I think that, yeah, he's been a big influence of mine. And then so I'm going to show you 3 more pieces of mine. This is a piece called Purple Tendril, where I was, again, playing with multiple parts, trying to get them to intersect and interact with one another. Almost trying to drip that tendril off of the edge of the pedestal as if it were going to maybe slink over the side. This is called Fruiting Body. 2 forms in an embrace. It's playing around with contrast between surfaces as well. Just interested in seeing how something might have a soft form but then a rough texture, and then things growing. And then lastly, this is called Lucky Stars. This is the piece, one of the pieces upstairs in the auction exhibit. And I show it because I think it's a really important piece for me. It was one of the first times when I was making separate parts and putting them together, sometimes employing a little bit of epoxy if I had to, but even more so than that, the little coral fingers that you see come out of their holes, right? So I was really trying to understand, how can I build something that is in more aligned with my expressive drawings without them just breaking and being broken sculpture right away? And my solution has been to make separate parts and then add them to the pieces, take them apart, store them, transport them, put them back together. And so it's really opened up a lot of windows for me. This is one of the first pieces, I think, that revealed that solution. All right, and I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. If you guys want to follow me on Instagram, it's @JoeJingles, and my website is jtaylor.art. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Joe, I'm curious, have any of your former students seen your work?
Like from the university? Yeah, I think a lot of them have. Or are you talking about the little ones?
No, I'm talking about the littles.
The little ones, no, not so much. No, I haven't been. They all live still in like Nevada, so they haven't gotten to come see the work. However, I did have a show at the ZAC, Zootown Art Center in Missoula, and they had a lot of students coming in there and having these drawing sessions with the pieces, and they were creating all these stories about the pieces and sort of, imparting their own sort of ideas of what was going on onto them. So that was a really cool opportunity to see like younger students interacting with them. Yeah.
I feel like throughout your presentation, I was curious, you kind of touched on it, but what your relationship is with the negative space, thinking about where you began with a vast landscape featuring, your body or some natural element that sort of creates scale, but, what you're thinking about when it comes to your work and the little bits of negative space that are featured in like a composition or even in the texture, you kind of touched on how you're referencing hawks in natural formations and then sort of recreating that in your work, but I just wanted to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the negative space operates in a lot of different ways, and honestly, it's kind of tricky because I think it's really easy, especially in clay, to try to omit that negative space, right? Clay wants to be a chunk sitting on the table. But one of the ways that I think I do it with most of my sculptures now is I try to create rounded bottoms on everything. I don't like it so much when my pieces sit flat on the ground. I think that piece in the corner, Feeling All the Feels, does sit flat on the ground on that left side. But there's something about that lift, getting that space underneath the pieces that gives them a little bit more like animation, like they have a little bit more life of their own. But then I think going back to like Matthew Grone's work, just like the negative space was an opportunity for tension, right? To try to put these things together. But yeah, it's always a bit of a struggle, I think, that it's hard to get that negative space in there because clay doesn't want to stick out and not have supports. So it's just trying to figure out ways to do that. Yeah.
I just got a question for you, for someone who's working in non-representational art and someone who's worked 15 years with kids in the education system. How do you answer the whole sentiment of, oh, my kid could make that?
Oh yeah. I think that that's true. Right? It's true. But the thing that I think people miss is that it takes a lot of confidence to do that.
Right.
And I think art making, especially for young people, is about building confidence. You know, it's about getting them to engage with the unknown or with these things and put themselves, make a thing, wonder what the heck it is, and then put it out there in the world to view. And then, or make a thing, break it, make it again. And so I think that, oftentimes, as an adult artist, making professional work, I'm always looking for ways to sort of get beyond that question a little bit, but I end up doing it not in the content of my work, but rather through the surface and the sort of how do you say it, the visceralness of the sculptures. I think that there's always going to be people that look at an object and be like, I don't know what that is, I don't know why you would do that. But then sometimes you're going to see those same people find one of your sculptures and be so struck by it, and they just don't know why. And I think that in that moment, it doesn't matter what they think, it's working. It's definitely working. But yeah, it is a thing that is that I've had come up before. But honestly, I think it's okay. I think it's I'm always working on my craftsmanship and my work, and I'm always interested in seeing what is sort of revealed from my process back to me. And I think it's maybe it's from being a teacher for so long and really pushing that iteration and pushing that, just taking that step and having confidence in doing that, that maybe is a place where I come from to make my own work too. Yeah.
I was very impressed by the big leap from the clay color to these bright colors.
Yeah.
How do you put the bright colors together? Is there some process, or does it speak to you? In fact, I found that very impressive to make that big jump.
Yeah. That big jump, that was definitely a jump into the void. I think a big part about using color for me is I'm really drawn to it because I don't understand it that well. I think I've been reading actually a lot of books. There's another really great book called The Anthology of Turquoise by Ellen Malloy, and she's talking about turquoise and the way that the turquoise water shimmers in a certain time of day, these areas, and I don't know, color has an emotional quality to it that I don't quite understand yet. But I'm constantly putting things together to see how I understand them and what they might mean. And I think the closest that I've gotten, or one of the tricks that I've started to use in my choosing of colors, is to use tertiary colors instead of opposite colors. So instead of having so many vastly different colors, trying to choose 3 or 4 shades of green and then maybe an accent color. So that gives me a chance to maybe understand the emotional qualities of green, right? But yeah, I still very much feel like a novice, but I think that's great because there's a lot of room to grow there as well. Also, I think Matthew Brone, I've got him in my ear a lot, where he often is talking about when he's making an object that looks like it's supposed to be a certain color, maybe it references a leaf, or maybe it references whatever, an elbow or something like that. He always tries to go in the opposite direction of what you'd expect. Right, so it's another step away from that control, a step away from that expectation of what it should look like or how it should be organized, and into some sort of mystery or some sort of unknown space of how is it going to operate if I make it purple, or how is it going to operate if I make it neon yellow. Does that kind of answer the question? Maybe.
I was going to make a follow-up comment.
Sure, go ahead.
I think it also goes back to your teaching the K through 12. Young children, they don't care, right, what color the sun is, it's blue.
Yeah.
I just think that possibly there could be some influence and freedom in that also.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah, thank you.
How do you technically achieve the coloring
Oh,
and the shading?
I'm spraying.
Cool.
I'm spraying a lot of my colors. So I'm doing a lot of things actually. I will spray a base layer of colored slip onto a piece, and then I will fire it on in the kiln to bisque. And then that color can't be rubbed off anymore, so you can put another color over it, and then you can wipe it off the surface so it stains the recesses. So you can start to get these colors to have a little bit more depth to them. Also, I'm not afraid if I fire something once or twice or 3 times and it comes out of the kiln and I still don't like it, I will often use other neat materials. I've experimented with putting waxes on things, or even using paints. They have a certain quality to them too that I'm always trying to avoid a little bit. So maybe putting on paints and sanding it back off. But yeah, just still trying to figure out what some of those moves are that I can make these surfaces that really are grabbing and really enticing. It's a challenge. Surface is a real challenge.
Kind of a comment and a question, but Molly's question about the negative space. This display you have up here, kind of in the nature of Ikebana, where the object shapes the space it's in.
Yeah.
What was your thought process on this particular installation of how many pieces and how each one kind of influenced and shaped the spaces in?
Sure. So it started by putting in a couple of pieces at a time and seeing kind of how much the space could hold. Right? I had a lot of sculpture. I'm a really prolific maker. I make a lot of things, and so I had a lot of sculpture to choose from. So the process for me was put things in the middle of the space, see how they can sort of take up space. But then it was thinking about the way that they are communicating between each other, either with their directionalness, literally the yellow worm pointing at the big purple piece, or sort of having pieces from across the room talking to each other through references in color, right? And so it was interesting to walk around and see this one, the corner red piece is sort of picking up on the red, and that piece, which is maybe subtly picking up on the pink in the corner there, and then seeing if I can get that to tie into something across the room. So I wanted the whole thing to sort of have relationship to each other across the space. We also made some decisions about placement based on what it looked like from the doorways, so that when you came into the middle gallery space and you looked into the big room, you would have a really framed up version of this leaning yellow piece. Or on the other side of the room, there was the taller piece hung up on blue that was framed with that doorway. And so it kind of was nice that you could see one piece through the doorway, but you actually had to walk through the door and look around the corner before everything else was revealed. So just trying to employ some tactics like that, just try to push that sort of exploration feeling for the viewer. The other thing that I think worked really well though in terms of setting this room up though, is that we took all the lights out. After we set up the show, took all the lights out, and then put one light up at a time on one piece. So you were basically just eliminating all the lights first, and then adding them back one by one, and then we got to a point where it's ooh, it's dark and ominous and spooky. Perfect, let's stop. And so that's kind of how that decision was made. It made this it almost really felt like you were walking into somebody's or some other world, Yeah.
What is the scale again on these?
3 feet to 7 feet. Yeah. Pretty big for a ceramic sculpture. Not humongous, but big enough. Yeah.
I'm just curious. I know ceramics have a certain texture to it, but they can change the texture. Do you have a preferred texture? Smooth, soft, rough?
Both.
Bumpy? All?
Yes.
Yeah, always both. I'm always looking for ways to contrast. Smooth with rough, shiny with matte. I definitely am employing that in just about everything that I make. It's I want that contrast to exist in that regard. It's kind of funny though, because some of the rougher textures, they might look like you want to touch them, but when you touch them, they're not that nice. They don't feel that good. But I really want the sculptures to do that through texture. I want the viewer to not be able to help themselves and touch the pieces, even though you're not supposed to. That's the goal, right? So I think texture helps with that a lot, though, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're
Thank
welcome.